Okay, I hope you guys are doing good. I hope you guys are having a really good week. Welcome to another section of the chapter. And in this video, basically, we're going to be looking at more aspects of fiscal policy. Again, if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. Talk to the SI, send me an email. Don't wait for an amalgamation of the videos. Don't wait for the videos basically to pile up before you start watching them. It might probably be too late then, okay? Try and set up some time to actually watch them, okay? Right, so the last time we left off, basically we were looking at government debt, and we said the United States government basically owes about $27 trillion. Now, one way to actually sort of reduce debt or to reduce that deficit is basically increasing taxes, okay? Right, but what would you say about the government basically collecting taxes? Are taxes a good thing, right? In fact, how much taxes are too much taxes, right? So imagine a scenario, imagine a world where the government basically takes 100% of your tax, of your income. Okay, so the tax rate is, let's say, 100%. Well, in that sense, you say, well, the government is actually making a lot of revenue, but is that really the case? Okay, yes, logically, if the government actually increases taxes, right, the government basically makes more revenue, right? But at some point, if the government of a country or basically of a society increases taxes, basically to pay off its debt, at some point people will begin to revolt because nobody wants to pay 100% tax rate, right? If the government is basically going to collect all your income, then what is the point of working? Okay, and this is what an economist called Arthur Laffer basically thought about. He actually said, well, at some point, if you actually increase taxes, you basically actually make less revenue, at least from the government's perspective, okay? And Afalafa was a famous economist actually under the Reagan administration from 81 to 89. And he actually drew this sort of model or graph on a napkin where he actually argued to President Reagan in a restaurant that, you know what, actually reducing taxes might actually increase revenue for the government. And that was quite against the logic. Well, if the government basically increasing taxes basically increases revenue for you. Okay, because remember, taxes are basically revenue for the government. Now, he's arguing that actually reducing taxes could actually incentivize people to pay more taxes. Okay, so we look at the relationship between tax revenues and what we call the Laffer curve, okay? Now, in terms of that, we basically need to look at, let me get my pen ready. We basically need to look at tax revenue and the tax rate. Under normal circumstances, you think that, well, if the tax rate increases, tax revenue should increase, so maybe the relationship should be positively sloped and look like that, okay? Right, but according to Laffer, well, maybe the relationship is not necessarily linear, or it's not just a straight line. It's actually maybe an inverted U, okay? Right, so we have the tax revenue over here, and we have the tax rate here, right? And according to the Laffer curve, right, basically the relationship between tax revenue and the tax rate is not necessarily linear. You get to a certain point where if you actually increase tax rate, okay, so let's say at this point right here, if you actually increase tax rate, you actually make less revenue. Okay, so as tax rate basically increases, your revenue begins to basically go down. Okay, right, so in that sense, he actually argued on a napkin to President Reagan that, hey, you know what? Every society and every country, or basically every economy, has an optimal tax rate, okay? Right, so according to the Laffer curve, right, basically T star is the optimal tax rate. Okay, at this tax rate, the government will basically get its maximum revenue. Okay, so at this tax rate, tax revenue is basically maximized. Anywhere beyond this tax rate, well, taxes might increase or decrease depending on where you actually fall on the curve. Okay, right. So he argued that for a tax rate that is basically below T star, so any tax rate that falls on the left-hand side, okay? Right? So for example, if the tax rate is, let's say, 10%, and you increase the tax rate to 15%, okay, you basically increase revenue. Okay, so let's say you increase revenue from, let's say, 3 trillion to, let's say, 4 trillion. Okay, so revenue basically increases. Okay, so mathematically, well, according to him, anytime you actually below the optimal tax rate, which we call T star, right, an increase in the tax rate will basically increase revenue. Okay, and at the same time, he argued that anytime you actually to the right or above the optimal tax rate, an increase in taxes will actually reduce revenue. Okay, so let's say this is 20, the tax rate is 20. Suppose you increase it to, let's say, 25. Okay, right, you're basically going to move from this point to essentially this point. Okay, and let's say tax revenue is 15. Okay, tax revenue decreases to basically 12. Okay, so anytime you actually sort of beyond the optimal tax rate, well, according to Arthur Laffer, and the model is basically named after him, which is really cool. Okay, hopefully I get to develop something, I get a model named after me as well. According to Arthur Laffer, well, at some point you can actually reduce taxes, because imagine if you reduce taxes from 25 to 20, you can actually reduce taxes, okay, and actually increase revenue. Okay, right. Now, he argued that the United States was somewhere beyond this optimal tax rate. Okay, that was his argument. So he was basically arguing to Ronald Reagan that, you know what, to actually increase taxes, to actually increase tax revenue, and to actually close the deficit, you know what, Reagan, you should actually decrease taxes, because the United States is way beyond this optimal tax rate. If you actually decrease taxes, people will be incentivized to pay more taxes, and tax revenue will actually increase. Okay, well, that was a really big mistake. Why? Because you can see from the Reagan presidency, which was basically, I think, from 81 to 89, right, the United States deficit actually worsened. Okay, because tax revenue was basically low, at the same time expenditure was basically high. Okay, so if you look at this gap, okay, basically the deficit actually worsened, right? So that is what Reagan did. He basically reduced taxes. So remember, maybe you've heard of the Reagan tax cuts. He basically reduced taxes, and at the same time he increased expenditure, thinking that reducing taxes will increase revenue and make up for the increase in expenditure. But Laffer actually, in theory, was right, but his calculation of where the United States basically falls in terms of the Laffer curve was absolutely wrong, right? The United States basically was below its optimal tax rate. Okay, so the United States was around this point where reducing taxes actually will reduce revenue. Okay, so reducing taxes, moving to the side, right, will have revenue basically reducing. Okay, right, and if you look at other advanced countries, the United Kingdom is also below its optimal tax rate. Okay, and we have France being at its optimal tax rate, where tax revenue is basically maximized. Okay, right, so you have to be careful in terms of actually looking at where you actually lie on the tax curve, or the Laffer curve, essentially. Okay, right, so that is basically what a Laffer curve basically looks at. Okay, what a Laffer curve basically looks at. Okay, right, now the next thing we'll look at is basically generational effects of fiscal policy. And again, like we said earlier, the current debt is $27 trillion. To some extent, at this point, it doesn't really matter who caused it, but how are we going to end up paying for the debt? Okay, and more importantly, who is going to end up paying for the debt? Someone has to pay for the debt. Okay, right. So some questions we need to ask ourselves is the budget deficit a burden on future generations? Are future generations the ones going to basically pay for this debt? Okay, is the budget deficit the only burden on future generations? Okay, what about the government debt? What about social security benefits? Okay, those are things we basically need to look at also. And also, doesn't matter who owns the bonds that government sells to finance its deficit. So basically, treasury bills. Remember, treasury bills are basically sort of US government debt, right? So you hold a treasury bill and the government basically promises to pay you that amount, at a future date with some interest. Okay, so basically it's almost like you lending the government's money when you buy a treasury bill. Okay, so to answer all these questions, which I think are really important questions, especially for society today, right? We use a tool called generational accounting. And generational accounting, basically, I'll just use the textbook definition, is an accounting system that measures the lifetime tax burden and the benefits of each generation. Okay, so that is what generational accounting is. It's an accounting system that measures the lifetime tax burden and benefits of each generation. Well, you're probably wondering to yourself at this point, Dr. Kweku, well, how do we do generational accounting? Well, generational accounting, in its purest form, tends to be a bit complicated. But there's an idea we've actually studied, or there's an idea we've actually looked at, that basically helps us to sort of explain generational accounting, okay? So, well, in generational accounting, basically, you need to think of taxes being paid by people with jobs, okay? So currently, if you have a job, you basically pay taxes, okay? Right? Now, income taxes and social security taxes, right, are paid by people who basically have jobs. Like you don't have a job, but I do have a job, so I do pay income taxes, right? Well, when those people retire, they are paid social security benefits, okay? So they actually pay sort of into a fund because they pay the government a certain amount of money, right? And the government basically is supposedly supposed to keep that money and then basically use it to fund social security benefits, okay? Right. So people who are working in their lifetime basically pay these taxes, and essentially, right after they done working, they basically paid social security benefits. Now, to actually see generational accounting in its full effects, we basically need to compare the value of an amount of money at a point when you are working with the value of the money at your retirement years. Basically, the value of money in terms of you paying taxes, okay, right, versus the value of benefits paid to you when you are no longer working, okay? And in that sense, we need to look at our good old friend present value, okay? So present value is an amount of money that if invested today will grow to an equal given future amount when the interest that it earns is taken into account. Okay, so essentially, right, if you invest $100 today, right, at a certain interest rate, how much is that $100 going to be at a certain time period? Okay, basically that is present value. Okay, right, and present value is basically used in generational accounting. Okay, right, but again, we won't go through the computation of generational accounting because it tends to be quite a complicated sort of math, right? So we looked at one issue that generational accounting sort of helps us with, okay, and basically is the social security time bomb. Okay, the social security time bomb. Okay, so when social security was being put in place in the early 1900s, okay, today's age demographic wasn't really considered. Okay, so after World War II, there was a huge surge in birth rates. Okay, when the guys got back home, they decided to make a lot of babies, right? After going through what you've seen, after going through war and what you've seen at war, you decide that life is really important, so you decide to settle down and basically have a family, right? So the United States government basically had a huge birth rate, right after World War II, okay? So basically those were the baby boomers, okay? Right, you probably heard the term, okay, boomer, right? That's basically a slang for someone who is really, really old, okay? Well, we're facing a social security time bomb because in 2008, the first of the baby boomers started collecting, and these are a lot of people, okay? And social security, sort of the funds in social security basically did not account for that, okay? So in 2008, the first of the baby boomers started collecting social security pensions, and in 2011, they became eligible for Medicare benefits, okay? Now, the problem we face is that by 2030, baby boomers basically reach retirement age, okay? Right, so by 2030, all the baby boomers will have reached retirement age, and the population supported by Social Security would have doubled. Okay, so where are we going to get the money to basically pay for those baby boomers who actually reach retirement age? And that is basically 10 years from now. Okay, 2030 is not too far. Right, and under existing social security laws, the federal government basically has the obligation and is mandated by law to pay for social security benefits and also Medicare benefits. But unfortunately, due to a changing age demographic, okay, right after World War II, right, the federal government, and also due to the fact that the federal government has been running a fiscal deficit, basically doesn't have enough funds to basically pay for social security. Okay, so this is a huge monumental problem that the United States of America is basically facing. Who is going to be paying for all those social security benefits? Okay, right, and like I said earlier, basically under law, the federal government is supposed to meet its obligations, right? And to basically sort of assess the full extent of the government's obligations, we use a term what we call fiscal imbalance. Right, and fiscal imbalance is almost like generational accounting. Okay, so fiscal imbalance basically looks at the present value of the government's commitments to pay benefits minus the present value of its tax revenue. Okay, so a research, so that is basically the definition for fiscal imbalance. And again, at this level, you don't need to know how to calculate these, but if you take a class in public policy or public finance, you'll probably learn how to calculate it. But at this surface level, you don't really need to know how to calculate it, okay? Now, the interesting thing about fiscal imbalance is that fiscal imbalance has been used by economists to basically calculate how much the United States government owes in terms of social security benefits, okay? Right, and two famous economists, Gokhale and Smethurst, basically calculated the fiscal imbalance, and they noticed the fiscal imbalance was $68 trillion, right, in 2014, which is basically 4 times the value of total production in 2014, or total income in 2014. Essentially, the United States government basically has $68 trillion worth of social security benefits it's supposed to pay out over time, and it basically can't meet that obligation. Why? Because the amount it's supposed to pay out is basically 4 times down what the United States government is basically earning in the first place. Okay, and apparently this amount grows by about $2 trillion a year. Okay, and that is way more than what the economy is basically producing. Okay, so you're basically facing a conundrum right now, right? And one question I want you to think about, and maybe at this point I want you to sort of pause the video and maybe just think about this, okay? How can the government basically meet its social security obligations, right? How can the government basically sort of pay for its social security benefits, okay? Maybe at this point you should just pause the video and think about it. Right, now, Gokhale and Smethurst basically consider 4 alternatives, okay? Well, the first alternative is, well, just increase taxes, okay? At the end of the day, just increase taxes. You increase taxes, the government gets more revenue, right? And by increasing taxes, you can basically maybe sort of help in paying for those social security benefits, okay? So one way is increasing taxes. Well, the other way is also to increase income social security taxes. After all, we pay social security taxes, so why not increase the taxes of those? After all, if you're gonna get paid social security benefits, maybe you should put in more than is actually in the fund right now, okay? So one way is to increase social security taxes. The other proposal they come up with is, well, maybe social security benefits should just be cut. I mean, if you don't have the funds to pay for social security benefits, why not reduce them in the first place, okay? So maybe cut social security benefits. And the fourth one they suggested was basically cut federal government discretionary spending, okay? So cut federal government discretionary spending, okay? So essentially cut government spending, right? But the problem with government spending is basically, well, we need the government to spend on infrastructure such as roads, education, health, which are really important. So if we cut government spending, well, maybe the economy might not grow as much, right? And yes, if we cut government spending, we might probably not run into a fiscal deficit, but at least we have enough money to basically pay for essentially the social security benefits, okay? Right? In that sense, well, what they suggested was that for the $64 trillion or $68 trillion to basically be reduced, right? Income taxes basically across board should be increased by 69%. social security taxes, or you decide to increase social security taxes by 95%, which is basically not feasible, all social security benefits should be cut by 56%. Okay, right? So any of these should basically help, right? Now, as you're looking at this, you should probably think to yourself, well, Dr. Kweku, which of these is the easiest to do? Okay, which of these is the easiest to do? And to be honest, I don't really have a clear-cut answer. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. All of them are difficult to do, and all of them have various ramifications for the economy. Okay, but definitely this is something we need to think about as we go forward. Okay, well, I'll stop over here, and then next time we'll look at the final chapter. The final segment of chapter 13. Okay, again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was helpful to you. Okay, thank you.